This is my first time starting seeds in 2025. I have never been so excited to have a bucket of dirt on a table. Like, if you're a gardener, I think you probably get it. This is the time of year where we see a lot of frustration around seed starting. So I thought today I would walk you through all of the common things that can go wrong with seed starting and why I think people find seed starting so hard, so that by the end of the video, you will have exactly what you need to successfully grow seeds. And we're gonna talk a little bit about our very first thing that we're seed starting today, which is something I've actually never grown before somehow. We're growing onions today. We're growing Patterson onions. So onions are one of the first things that can go out in the garden as soon as the ground can be worked. So we're getting a head start on these, getting them going in the greenhouse now that it's a little bit warm. You could even winter sow your onions, but I'm gonna start them in the greenhouse today. And I'll walk you through kind of my thinking of how I'm planting these, as well as what we can do to prevent a lot of the issues that happen with seed starting. Quick thank you to Bootstrap Farmer for sponsoring this video. We are going to talk about the best things to use for seed starting today, but first we need to get these filled. I don't see many people talking about this, but seed starting, it's kind of unnatural if you think about it, especially if you don't prioritize growing a perennial native garden. A lot of what we grow as vegetable gardeners depends on us kind of cheating the system a little bit. Here in Massachusetts, I've got 49 days of frost-free weather, guaranteed, give or take a little bit here and there. So that means if I'm growing something with a longer growing season, like a pepper, that could take, I don't know, up to 150 days just about to mature, I don't have the time to wait for that to happen outside. So essentially we're trying to grow things that would never have thrived in the climate that I'm in. So to me, when I'm talking a lot about low maintenance gardening and all of that, of course, I'm always preaching that we need to be working with nature, not against it. And seed starting is a little bit the opposite of that in some ways. We're working against nature and trying to replicate a natural ecosystem. So of course, it's gonna be a little bit harder for some of us than others to replicate that system in a way that's conducive to plant growth. A lot of the ways that we combat issues with seed starting depend on us replicating different natural environments. Okay, I've already got dirt everywhere. If I'm being totally honest, I don't really like seed starting. It's not my favorite thing. This time of year, I get excited about it because obviously it's like the first garden task that we can do even when it's still snowing outside, which is really nice. But it's safe to say I've done everything in my power to make seed starting as easy as possible. So I'm gonna share those tips with you today in the hopes that it also helps make seed starting a little bit easier for you. Maybe you're just starting gardening, or maybe last year you experienced one of these issues and you're trying to avoid repeating it. So I'm just packing these cells really tightly, because what happens is the soil will kind of settle in the cells, and if we don't fill it up all the way, especially with these small cells where it really matters, then it's just gonna sink and there will be less food for your seedlings to thrive on. I've also pre-moistened this, and I'm just using a potting mix. You can use a seed starting mix too, it doesn't matter. I just had some potting mix, and that's what I prefer to use because I feel like I have to feed it less often when I use a potting mix, which is nice. It's still light enough to where the seedlings don't have trouble breaking through it as they're germinating, but I guess I'm just gonna get dirt absolutely everywhere in this process, which is fine. I intentionally knew I needed to clean the greenhouse so we can do a deep clean. So let's start at the beginning though, because I think probably the number one issue that people have in starting seeds is poor germination. So the seeds don't sprout. And there's a lot of things that can cause this, but it's most definitely one of these things. So the first would be improper depth, right? So a lot of seeds, if they're really small, they need to be very close to the surface so they don't have to work as hard to get through the soil when they're first sprouting. Or if it's a bigger seed, it actually needs to be way deeper. So as a good general rule of thumb, you should be planting your seeds about 2 times deeper than the seed is wide. Now, some seeds really prefer to be sown directly on the surface. That works really well for me with carrots and with lettuce. Another thing that can happen is if the seeds have not been stored properly, that can significantly reduce your germination rate. So you want to be keeping them in a cool, dry place where they aren't experiencing major temperature differences and fluctuations or humidity fluctuations, because that's going to just break down the protective shell of the seed that's keeping it from sprouting too early. Another reason that you might experience germination issues, specifically with heat-loving plants like your peppers, is that they might need a specific temperature to germinate at. So if I were to start my peppers right now in the greenhouse without any heat mat or anything to keep the temps above like 50 degrees, they probably would not sprout because they need that heat to activate and to germinate. You might also experience issues with germination if your soil moisture is not right. So we like to keep a really humid environment when we're first starting our seeds. If the surface of the soil dries out, the seed's not gonna be activated. It's not gonna wake up. So that's why I use the humidity domes that come with the Bootstrap Farmer kit. I'm gonna link the kit for you down below. It has the whole rainbow of these trays, these 6 cells, as well as these, I think these are the 3.3 inch pots that you can kind of up pot into. So you don't have to like worry about getting all these things individually, like it's all in one kit, which is really nice. But the humidity domes are huge. Like I would say that's probably one of the most common issues people have when they're trying to germinate seedlings and it's not working. A lot of the times, if it's not temperature related, it's moisture related. But sometimes you just get really bad quality seeds. Like I test out seed companies all the time because it's part of my job. And you will find that some have higher germination rates than others. So it can be worth spending an extra $1 or $2 on higher quality seeds. Although I know plenty of people who use the seeds from the Dollar General and they work just fine for them. It's not a risk I take in my own garden, but if you're on a budget, there's nothing wrong with it as long as you've got the other factors in place to make it successful. And this is not to deter you from starting seeds. I just think that people often go into it without an understanding of what causes these problems. And just learning about the problems themselves isn't going to help you if you don't understand why it's happening. And oftentimes it's because we are working against nature. So in the case of something like leggy seedlings, if you're experiencing your seedlings are getting really long and spindly, but they don't have the foliage to support that height, usually what that means is the plant is stressed for light. Because again, we're trying to grow these typically under artificial lights, and they're reaching and reaching for that sun because it's not close enough to them for how weak it is compared to how strong the sun would have been in that scenario. That can be a big factor for leggy seedlings, and you just want to make sure that you're starting off with a good strong light that has the right frequency. I like one that has a red frequency to it if I'm using a grow light. I'm not going to use a grow light on these. I'm just going to plant them in the greenhouse because I should have enough light out here by now. I've checked online. There's like a time and date website and it tells you basically how many hours of sunlight you're currently getting, and we're over 10 hours. So it should be okay for things like onions. For something that requires a lot more light, I might do something different. Like with hot peppers, I'll probably still start those under grow lights. And then we have damping off disease. And this isn't something that I've personally experienced in my garden, but it is fairly common of an issue for gardeners to be dealing with, especially with lower quality soils, I've noticed. So damping off disease, it basically looks like the plant grows and it looks okay, and then out of nowhere it just withers up and dies. And usually it's caused by overwatering. And water is kind of the probably trickiest thing about starting seedlings indoors. You can overwater them, you can underwater them. I think it's generally best practice to let them start to dry out a little bit in between watering so that there's not as much of an opportunity for this fungal growth to happen. And we'll also talk about like different watering techniques that will make this less likely to happen too, as well as keep mold and fungus from forming. But it's usually caused by overwatering and or poor circulation, which can also cause a whole host of other issues. So again, if we're thinking about like rain and wind and how things would function in a natural environment while we're producing an artificial environment, if you're trying to replicate that, there's never no wind outside. There's always air moving around in circulation. So if you're starting seeds in an enclosed indoor space and it's not experiencing that circulation, it won't dry out as fast, which seems like it might be a good thing, except that oftentimes it doesn't dry out fast enough. And then we experience a whole bunch of issues, not just damping off. So it's a really good idea to have some kind of fan. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but some kind of fan available so that you can kind of mitigate these issues before they have a chance to happen, because leggy seedlings you can kind of fix depending on the plant, but damping off, like once that starts happening, there's not really a real recovery for it for the plant. If your plants seem to be growing, but they're not growing very fast, like they're having issues actually maturing, generally that's an issue with nutrient uptake. So that can be caused by a couple of things. If you're using a seed starting mix, one that's not very low quality, a seed starting mix is great for starting seeds in terms of its texture and giving the plants just a little bit of food. And the seed has enough energy stored within it to sprout. But once it's sprouted, it needs food. It needs to eat something. And generally it's eating something from the soil. So if you're using a seed starting mix, not potting mix, it only has a little bit of fertilizer in it. And you're gonna need to get on a fertilizing schedule to keep those plants fed, which is just like so much work. Like, I don't wanna do that. I don't know about you, but I don't have time for that. I barely have time for this. So for me, that's a big reason why I choose to use potting mix, because I generally don't have to fertilize for like the first month. And even then I'm only fertilizing very lightly, if at all. Like, it's very much more forgiving, especially a high quality potting mix that has a slow release fertilizer built into it. That's going to probably be your best bet. But that will explain a lot of issues with plants kind of having stunted growth, not maturing. It can also be an issue with your lights. If you don't have the right frequency of light, that can happen. One thing I experience a lot starting seeds is pests. I actually get a lot of fungus gnats because I use a high quality soil. For me, a high quality soil means it has a lot more organic matter. It's not sterilized. So the trade-off with that is that it's much more likely to harbor fungus gnats, which overall fungus gnats are way overrated. Like, they're not as big of a deal in the garden as people make them out to be. But when you have young, fragile seedlings, that's not going to help things. Fungus gnats are usually something I recommend air circulation for, but also it comes down to your watering technique, because if we can keep the top, very top layer of the surface of the soil dry, those fungus gnats typically don't have the ability to complete their life cycle. So that is where we would be bottom watering our plants, which is just better for the overall health anyway. So with a tray like this, I would just lift up one, pour in the water, and then put it back down and let it slowly absorb it over time. If it's already gotten really bad, you can use sticky traps to trap the adults. And then you would also want to use those mosquito dunks that have BTI in them, which is a natural organic chemical that actually stops the larva from growing. It works on mosquitoes, and so people use it in like their standing water features and things, but it also works on the fungus gnat larvae, so that can kind of break the cycle if you already have an issue with them. And the air circulation will help too. It doesn't need to be like a 60-mile-an-hour gale force wind. It just needs to have some air movement around it. It makes a really big difference. As for stuff like root rot or wilting, a lot of times people will assume that wilting is caused by underwatering, but a lot of the times it's actually caused by overwatering. I honestly think most of our problems with starting seeds is that we're watering them way too much, way too much. Like again, think back to nature. In most climates, does it rain every single day? Is the soil completely saturated all the time? No. Plants need that kind of drying off period for their roots specifically, because otherwise the roots will rot. Even if you're bottom watering, you don't want your roots sitting in water. They need to dry out a little bit in between waterings. So if you're noticing wilting with like yellowing of leaves especially, that to me indicates that there's more of an issue with too much water rather than not enough water. So say we get past all of these hurdles with seed starting and we get to transplanting. A lot of times we can lose our seedlings that we've worked so hard to keep alive for weeks and weeks just because we don't take into consideration transplant shock. So what that means is we need to be hardening off our seedlings and we're being mindful of not disturbing the root. And that's one of the things I really like about the Bootstrap Farmer seed cells. They've got this little finger hole in the bottom. So rather than having to like pull on the plant or squeeze it from the sides, this is going to minimize the disruption to the roots quite a lot. And they're really durable. Like you guys know, I don't like to use plastic in the garden unless it's something that is going to last and not end up in a landfill. And there's very few seed trays out there that check those boxes for me, and Bootstrap Farmer is one of them. And before I get into the tips for planting the onions, we've got one last tip for seed starting in general. And I think it's the thing that ends up hurting new gardeners the most as they're just kind of learning. And that's timing, because if we start our seedlings too early, what's gonna happen? Those plants are gonna get really stressed. This is especially true with tomatoes, and I think a big reason why my tomatoes didn't do so well last year was because I started them way too early. I got really excited to start them, which, I mean, how could you not after a long winter want to start your tomatoes? But if you start them too early, even if you're up potting, like it helps to move things to larger containers as they outgrow them, because that's going to reduce the stress. But again, it comes back to this is an unnatural environment. So what are we doing when we keep a plant indoors under grow lights for longer than absolutely necessary to get it to reach the maturity to be ready to go outside? We're putting additional stress on them because of how unnatural that environment is. So this one gets a little tricky, and every gardener is going to tell you something different, especially when it comes to things that take a long time to mature, like tomatoes. I'm interested to see how early you like to start your tomatoes, because for me, I still haven't decided whether I'm going to do 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 12 weeks before our last frost. I'm kind of running out of time because we're getting there. Like our last frost date is usually May 5th. So I'm running out of time to make this decision. But onions are one where you can get away with starting them pretty early because they like the cold, or at least they don't mind it. So once the ground is ready to work, I can move them outside and they don't need to continue to be stressed. So like I said, this is actually my first time growing onions, and I'm really excited because we go through so many onions. I cook from scratch a lot. I've been eating vegetarian since I was 11, and so it's just kind of been like a necessity. Like a lot of what I eat has to be made from scratch, and onions are just a very key part of adding flavor to any meal, whether you're vegetarian or not. They're a staple, and we go through a lot of them. So I've wanted to do this for a while, but I knew they were going to take up a lot of space in a garden bed. And up until last year, I really just didn't have that space to spare for like doing a full year's supply crop of something in a raised bed. And I've also been a little bit intimidated by it. You know, there's like the day length hours and planting the right variety for your climate, but also planting one that's going to store for a long time, which is why I chose the Patterson onion, because it does store for a really long time. It's just a very dependable variety. And another thing I did to make it a little bit more dependable for me was I grabbed it from a company that is not local, they're in Maine, but near my climate. So hopefully these seeds came from plants that were adapted to a climate very similar to mine, versus if I had gotten Patterson onion seeds from a company in a zone 10, that would be very different. So Obviously, they're sourcing their seeds from many different places, but I believe overall they get them from Maine or nearby. And these seeds are tiny. Did I get pelleted seed? They're coated in something. I don't know what. NOP compliant seed coating. Does anyone know what that means? I don't know what that means. They're an F1 hybrid. So I'm doing 1/2 inch deep per the packet. 1/2 inch is a pretty safe bet for root crops in general. So like I said, you can start your Patterson onion seeds outside in milk jugs. You can do winter sowing with them. I don't want to risk it because I am planning for this to be a staple crop for me. I want to make sure that I'm getting the maximum amount out of them. But one really cool thing about growing onions is you can multi-sow them, and they do really well because they don't have tender root systems. So they can kind of be teased apart. So you could put 3 or 4 seeds in one of these little 6 cells. Or you could literally start like 20 or 30 in one of these and let them grow, get about 6 inches tall. Then you want to start trimming the green part that comes up so that it focuses more of its energy on the roots until it's ready to transplant. But seriously, they don't care. Like onions, as from what I've read, again, haven't grown them, can't say I'm an expert, but from all the reading that I've done, they really do not mind being multi-sown. And not only that, but I also read a really interesting piece that I think I'm gonna try. This market gardener who was kind of growing for yield did an experiment where they tried single sowing onions and multi-sowing onions in their beds. And they found that although the yield was pretty much the same, the amount of effort they had to put in was way less. So they were able to plant the same amount of onions in the same amount of space, but they had to prepare like half as many or a third as many holes because they just planted the onions together. So you could multi-sow these in each 6 cell, and then you could actually just keep them that way. You don't need to separate them out and individually plant them as long as you don't have like more than 4 in a bunch. So one of these 10 by 20 trays holds 12 containers, which is 72 cells. And I actually am planting 72 onions because I'm gonna fill 2 of my 2 by 6 foot beds with them. And for the spacing, that's like how many I can max it out with. I'm also going to companion plant some other things in the same bed. I'm gonna do chamomile because that's supposed to be really good at repelling some of the pests that are common for onions. And also I just want some chamomile in my garden. And I'm gonna do some early season lettuce because while the onions are small, it's not going to be competing for space to have lettuce in there. Lettuce has really shallow roots anyway. I may be able to continue to sow lettuce even after the onions have kind of established themselves, but we'll see. But it at least lets me maximize the growing space in the meantime. I'm really curious about what this coating is. You see that? Usually when you see onion seeds, they're just like pure black, and these have kind of like a dusty, chalky, speckled coating on them. So I like to say plastic has a purpose, and if plastic makes it possible for you to garden, you should always try to prioritize plastic that you can continue to reuse over and over and over again. So that's a big part of why I so strongly advocate for grabbing the trays from Bootstrap Farmer. I mean, they're obviously very pretty too, which is a huge plus. And the company themselves is just so nice. They're just so great to work with. They're very female-led and female-focused. They do a lot of work to make gardening more accessible for people, which is always very important for me to align myself with brands that are aligned with my values and my mission too. I will link the Bootstrap Farmer starting kit for you down below. It has all the things that you need. It's got the trays, it's got the seed starting cells. It just takes a lot of the worry and the guesswork out of it. And the construction of them is gonna help you prevent a lot of the issues that we've been talking about today. So I hope you will give them a try, and let me know in the comments if you have any other questions about seed starting, about Bootstrap, about growing onions. I might not be able to answer the onion growing questions because we're learning this together right now, but I will do my very best. I'm feeling so much more at peace just planting right now than I have all day. My brain has been very scattered. To just kind of spend some time with my hands in the dirt feels so good right now. To know that like we're gonna be harvesting so many onions in not that much time. Patterson's mature in 104 days, so We'll be picking these beginning of summer. I'm just giving these a light cover back up with the soil. I'm not patting it down hard because I don't want the seed to struggle to come through. I'm cutting it a little close because I didn't put any extras in any of these cells. Like I was gonna multi-sow, but then I realized the cells was the exact right amount I needed for onions, so we're just kind of hoping they all germinate. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for seed starting with me today. Make sure you hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos, and I'll see you in the next one.